Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Duran Duran's Rio music video. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying GCSE Eduqas Media Studies. This music video is currently a historical text on that specification at GCSE for component 2. You will only ever need to study this video in relation to media language and representation with some knowledge of context as well. So I'm going to go through those things in this video. The video begins with some sort of circular graphics that appear on the screen, kind of cut out so you can see the footage behind them. This idea of lots of graphics and shapes was quite popular in the 1980s and 1990s in music videos. In the shapes, we can see close-ups of women smiling and laughing, makes them seem quite happy, and it objectifies them. We're seeing just parts of them. This idea is almost like we're looking at them through a telescope or binoculars. So it creates this idea of almost voyeuristic images of women. This continues throughout this introduction to the music video. We see an over-the-shoulder shot of a man with a camera looking at a woman. She's faced away from the camera, lying on the floor. It's the idea that he's staring at her body. We're seeing him gazing at her, this idea of women being represented through the male gaze, objectified, sexualised, and men being represented perhaps as a little bit creepy. And perhaps that representation might only come through to modern audiences, because modern audiences might see this more as a little bit more misogynistic, whereas audiences in the 1980s might have seen this as much more acceptable. We see images of the band. They're all wearing kind of quite colourful, fashionable suits. These were all the rage in the 1980s. It made them seem quite successful, quite high status, quite wealthy. And this idea of, these kind of suits and living the high life was very popular, a representation for men in the 1980s. We had this term yuppies, this idea of men who were kind of rich and they liked high status things. We see some shots of a woman randomly getting covered in water, again sexualising her for the audience, making her seem soaking wet, which adds to that representation of her seeming quite provocative for an audience. The lyrics reference a bird of paradise, and that's this idea that women are kind of exotic, they're rare, they're beauties to be looked at. There's a lot of very sexualized imagery here with, very symbolic connotations. There's women being splashed with liquid on their bottoms. So it's this idea, it's really quite sexualized representations of women, and that might particularly be to appeal to a male audience. A woman walks out of the sea, she's in a bikini and she's got a knife strapped to her thigh. And this is quite a clear intertextual reference to Ursula Andress from the James Bond film Dr. No. So it would have been a familiar image to audiences, quite a good way of drawing in an audience by referencing popular products. It was also a highly sexualised image in the James Bond movie, and Ursula Andress, became quite a big sex object because of that scene. So again, adding to this representation of women being there to be looked at. In contrast, we get this representation now of the band member approaching her and almost kind of trying to kind of chat her up or flirt with her, but being met with a comedy response. So he gets bitten by a crab and she's laughing at him and he stumbles away. So actually, although they were earlier represented in their suits being quite suave and sophisticated, now we get a representation where the audience is encouraged to laugh at them. The woman actually kicks him over, so representing the women as being quite powerful and aggressive. And perhaps this ties into some of the representations in the 1980s for women. We started to get more powerful representations of women in the media at the time. So it might reflect some of the changing historical context in the 1980s. The band is seen on the deck of a sailboat going through the sea. The yacht obviously seems very rich, very expensive, and it makes them seem very wealthy and full of status. This idea of a group of white men sailing the seas in a tropical land, it gives quite a post-colonialist representation of ethnicity. I know at GCSE you don't necessarily need to know about post-colonialism, but if you want to, you can check out my video about Gilroy's theory on this. It's this idea of representing white people in positions of power, and in particular in positions of power when they are in foreign lands, and the representation of people from ethnic minority backgrounds in more kind of victimised or weak roles. We see a woman here covered in kind of tribal body paint, very exotic, very colourful. It makes her seem quite primal, quite tribal, which again ties into this representation of perhaps she's supposed to be like a local girl, which makes her seem more exotic. It kind of others her from the white band members. And because she's seen in this body paint, it means that she seems like she's nude, and that again adds to sexualised representation of women. There's lots of use of mirrors and reflections here, glass, and that's quite conventional in music videos. This idea of looking and seeing screens and images and reflections, and you can see that several times in the video when you're seeing people with things like binoculars, windows, that kind of thing. There's some quite surreal moments here. So this idea of there being a telephone in the sea, very, very odd. Adding this element of surrealism, again, surrealism is quite common in music videos too. It adds a kind of quite arty, avant-garde feel. There's a man here singing to the woman, and the lyrics are, "I've seen you on the beach." Little bit creepy, but again, perhaps that's because I'm seeing it from a modern perspective, and perhaps in the 1980s this actually would have been seen as quite kind of fun and flirtatious. In all of these shots within the music video, although women are sexualised and objectified, they all look very happy and very smiley. There's lots of shots of the woman smiling when they know they're being watched, so perhaps representing women as enjoying being looked at and liking the attention. And this, again, might have been done to particularly appeal to a male target audience who would enjoy the idea that women liked them looking at them. But again, we get the comedy representation. He's kind of flirting with her. The woman pulls the cable on the telephone, and the cable pulls the telephone out of his hands, and he falls into the water, which represents women as having a position of power and of not wanting a man. Although he's flirting with her, she doesn't need him. So perhaps making women seem quite independent. We see another band member here, this time reading a comic, Fighting Army. Adds to this representation of sort of masculinity and men being involved in war and fighting. But the fact that it's a comic book and he's a grown man adds to this idea that perhaps he's a little bit immature. We get a dream sequence, and we know it's a dream sequence because of the media language. It goes into black and white, and it's a little bit slow motion. He's got a gun and a headband on, which perhaps makes intertextual references to films such as Rambo, which audiences may well be familiar with as well. Adds to this idea of masculinity, makes him seem like a kind of archetypal hero. We get a shot here of a woman's stomach with a drink on it. By cutting off parts of their body in the shot and the frame, again, it adds this idea that women are objects, they're dehumanized. We're just seeing body parts rather than a whole person. We get some nice underwater shots here, which again emphasize the shape of the woman's body because of the silhouette and the light behind her. The low angle camera shot of the woman throwing the ball makes her seem very powerful and dominant within the frame. So then we see the band member running backwards on the pier, and this feels like it's going to be a typical slapstick comedy moment. We see a banana peel on the floor, and the audience assumes he's going to fall and slip on it, but he doesn't, so we get this kind of near miss. And then the ball comes into shot, and it's suddenly a gigantic ball, and it knocks him into the sea. So again, adding this element of surrealism and also comedy. We're laughing at the band members. They're portraying themselves as perhaps, a little bit silly, a little bit informal, and not afraid to laugh at themselves, not taking themselves too seriously. We got a lot of quite dodgy 80s special effects here. And again, these special effects may seem silly to a modern audience, but in the 80s, they were quite modern, and they perhaps might have been quite impressive to an audience at the time. We get this idea that one of the band members has been caught in a fishing net and the woman is pulling him in. Makes her seem like the predator and him seem like the prey, so as though he's quite victimised and weak and she is strong by comparison. We get some more surrealist shots here of people drinking neon drinks underwater. So a bit crazy, a bit different, and this might have made them seem like quite an unusual band at the time. The woman here again is in full body paint, which suggests nudity to sexualise her. The way she's moving is quite animalistic. It makes her seem as though she's a completely different species. So really representing men and women as quite binary opposite in this video. She appears to be stalking around the boat, the implication being that perhaps she's some kind of predator looking for her prey. We get some shots of the saxophone being played here. Showing kind of people playing instruments is quite conventional within music videos. It adds to this idea of musical skills. And the saxophone was quite a fashionable instrument within popular music in the 1980s. The exotic locations you can see in the background and throughout the whole music video really add to this idea of escapism for an audience. It makes it feel exotic and foreign and different and tropical, and that would have seemed like quite an aspirational, glamorous lifestyle for many audiences. The low angles of the singer make him seem very dominant and powerful, give him quite a sense of status within the shots. We get a montage here of some quite random surreal images. So we get the phone in the sea, spilling the drink on the boat. We get a woman covered in pink cream. Lord knows what's going on there. We get a man riding a horse. And then we see a man getting dressed in the background of the sea shot. And there's a mirror in the sea so he can adjust his bow tie. So really quite bizarre placements of props and costumes and things like that. And that adds to this idea of surrealism. It might have made the video seem quite unusual to an audience. And anything unusual is a good way of getting your band noticed. The backflip in the sea makes the band member seem quite impressive, quite sporty and quite masculine. We get some shots here of the band on the boat again, and the lead singer here is literally riding the kind of jib on the boat. I don't know, maybe that's not the technical term, I'm not a sailor. It's quite a phallic image. Phallic images are images where perhaps an item might represent a penis. So it's this idea of the jib of the boat making him seem particularly masculine. So, you know, trying to represent himself in a particularly macho way. We get some very kind of high fashion shots here of the woman in the blue dress with the billowing wind going through the chiffon of her dress and her hair. It seems very, very fashionable and dramatic. The woman here turns in the foreground and winks at the camera, and that adds this idea of drawing in the audience. It also makes us feel, it positions us as kind of conspirators for her. So it's almost as if we're on her side and we're laughing at the band as well. The band members are pretending to play imaginary invisible instruments here, which again adds to the sort of slight comedy feeling of the band. They start chucking each other off the boat. Again, this represents them as quite immature, quite silly, quite youthful. So that was my easy to understand guide to media language and representation in this music video. Don't forget to check out my channel for lots more videos relevant to you on the Eduqas GCSE and A-level exam boards. And if there are any videos that you would like that I don't already have, please drop me a comment below and I'll see what I can do.